Hello, my name is James. Welcome to Sleep Stories World. Tonight, drift into sleep with the extraordinary true story of Francis Drake, the first Englishman to sail around the world. In 1577, he set out with 5 ships and a bold dream. 3 years later, he returned with just 1 vessel and a treasure beyond imagination. Journey with us through storm-tossed seas and uncharted waters, from the frozen Straits of Magellan to the vast Pacific, where Drake captured a king's ransom and changed the course of history. This isn't fiction. It's the remarkable reality of human courage and ambition, told with the gentle, atmospheric pace designed to guide you into deep, restful sleep. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the Golden Hind carry you into dreams. But first, let's prepare your space for rest. Ensure you're somewhere comfortably cool, dark, and quiet. If you need to adjust anything, your curtains, your temperature, your pillows, please do so now. When you're ready, lie down and let yourself settle into your bed. Feel the weight of your body being supported. You may want to cover yourself with a light blanket as your body relaxes. Now, gently close your eyes. There's nothing you need to see anymore tonight. Your only task now is to be here, allowing yourself to receive the gift of rest. Take a deep breath in through your nose. And exhale slowly through your mouth. Breathe in deeply, feeling your chest expand. Breathe out, feeling your body sink deeper into your bed. In. And out. With each breath, you're signaling to your body that it's safe to rest. Now, imagine being surrounded by a warm, vibrant light. This light is gentle and comforting, carrying with it a deep sense of peace and safety. As you breathe in, let this warm light fill your chest. As you breathe out, imagine it spreading gently through your upper body. Breathe in, and let the light expand through your shoulders, your arms, your back. Breathe out, and feel it filling your stomach, your neck, your head, every space within you glowing softly. If a thought comes by, acknowledge it like watching a leaf float by on a gentle stream, and then let it drift away. There will be time for those thoughts later. Now is for rest. On your next breath in, let the warm light travel downward. Feel it reach your hips, your thighs, your knees. Breathe out and sense it flowing down to your ankles, to your toes. Every part of you now is surrounded by this gentle, warm glow. You are completely enveloped in comfort and peace. Focus on your breath and the warm light surrounding you. If your mind wanders, simply guide it back, gently, to your breath, to the light. You are safe. You are comfortable. You are exactly where you need to be. As we move into tonight's story, allow yourself to let go even more. Let the words wash over you like a gentle tide. You don't need to follow every detail. Simply receive the story as a gift, a soft companion as you journey towards sleep. And now, let us begin. In the quiet corners of English history, where the mists of Devon roll off ancient hills and the sea whispers its eternal song, there lived a man whose dreams would grow larger than the horizon itself. Francis Drake was born around 1540 in the small hamlet of Tavistock, where the moorlands meet the sky and the air carries the salt of distant waters. His beginnings were humble, the son of a farmer who would later become a preacher, and yet within this simple start lay the seeds of extraordinary ambition. Young Francis grew up in a world where the sea was not merely water, but possibility. His family moved to Kent when he was still a boy, and there, near the great naval dockyards of the River Medway, he was apprenticed to the master of a small trading vessel. The work was hard, the quarters cramped, but Drake learned the language of wind and tide, of rope and sail. When his master died, the old sailor left the ship to Francis, a gesture that spoke of recognition, of potential seen in a young man who already moved with the confidence of someone destined for larger decks. By his 20s, Drake had joined his cousin John Hawkins in voyages across the Atlantic. These were not gentle trading missions, but dangerous expeditions to the Spanish Main, that vast sweep of Caribbean waters and coastal territories controlled by Spain, where silver and gold flowed like rivers from the New World back to the Old. Here, Drake learned both seamanship and survival, for the Spanish did not welcome English ships in waters they claimed as their own. It was in 1573 that Drake's destiny began to crystallize, taking shape like dawn breaking over unknown waters. He and his close companion, John Oxenham, had been conducting raids along the Isthmus of Panama, that narrow bridge of land connecting two great continents. They had allied themselves with the Cimarrons, escaped African slaves who had found freedom in the dense jungles and mountains of Panama, building their own communities far from Spanish control. These Cimarrons knew the hidden paths, the secret ways through terrain that defeated European maps. One day, the Cimarron guides led Drake and Oxenham high into the Cordilleras Mountains, where the air grows thin and the world seems to stretch toward infinity. They climbed through cloud forests dripping with moisture, through passes where condors rode the thermals and the vegetation gradually gave way to rock and sky. And then, at a certain height, the guides paused and gestured for the Englishman to look. What Drake saw that day would haunt his imagination and shape the rest of his life. Standing in that high place, he could see in one direction the Atlantic Ocean, glittering in the eastern sun, the familiar waters that had carried him from England. But there, spreading vast and blue to the west, lay something few Englishmen had ever witnessed: the Pacific Ocean, the great South Sea that Magellan had named for its deceptive calmness. Two oceans, two worlds, visible from a single point of land. In that moment, Drake made a vow. There, with his hand upon a tree at the summit, he prayed to Almighty God for the chance to sail an English ship upon that distant Pacific water. It was more than ambition, it was vision. The Pacific represented not just unexplored territory, but unchallenged Spanish dominion, undefended treasure routes, and possibilities that existed beyond the reach of England's limited imagination. For the Pacific Ocean was Spain's private lake, or so they believed. Since Magellan's expedition had first crossed it decades earlier, Spanish galleons had sailed its waters virtually unopposed, carrying unimaginable wealth from the Philippines to the Americas, from Peru to Panama. The silver mines of Potosi in the Spanish territories produced such quantities of precious metal that mule trains, long processions of pack animals laden with silver bars, made regular journeys across the Isthmus of Panama. Drake had seen these mule trains, had even raided them, seizing silver that Spanish officials could barely comprehend losing, so accustomed were they to absolute control. But Drake's vision went beyond simple piracy. Standing on that mountain ridge, looking at the Pacific, he understood something profound. That ocean represented a route to wealth and glory that no Englishman had yet attempted. To sail into those waters would require more than courage. It would require backing, resources, ships, and the kind of ambition that could convince powerful people to invest in what seemed impossible. As he descended from the mountains, the image of that blue Pacific stayed with Drake like a compass point, guiding every decision, every plan. The treasure he took from Spanish mule trains was considerable. His raids along the Spanish Main had made him wealthy by the standards of common sailors, even by the standards of minor gentlemen. But Drake understood that wealth alone would not open the doors he needed to open. He needed connections, respectability, the ear of those who moved in the highest circles of English society. Drake returned to England a changed man, his pockets heavy with Spanish silver and his mind ablaze with the vision of that distant Pacific. But the England he returned to was a complex web of power and patronage, where even a sea captain of minor gentry, no matter how successful, could not simply announce grand plans and expect to be heard in the highest circles. The court of Queen Elizabeth I moved according to its own rhythms, its own careful dances of influence and favor. Yet Drake possessed something beyond wealth and ambition. He had charisma, that indefinable quality that draws powerful people into one's orbit. He understood how to tell a story, how to paint a picture of possibility that made even cautious investors lean forward in their chairs. And perhaps most importantly, despite his relatively modest Devonshire background, he had begun to move in circles of real power. Among those who took notice of Drake was Sir Francis Walsingham, the Queen's principal secretary, a man of formidable intelligence who served as Elizabeth's spy master and chief advisor on matters of security and foreign policy. Walsingham saw in Drake not just a capable sea captain, but a useful instrument for England's interests. Here was a man who could advance Protestant England's position against Catholic Spain while maintaining a convenient distance from official policy. If Drake raided Spanish ships and colonies, well, the Queen could always claim she knew nothing of such private ventures. This became the delicate game of Elizabethan sea power, encouraging privateers while maintaining plausible deniability. Drake also gained the attention of Sir Christopher Hatton, one of Queen Elizabeth's most trusted favorites at court. Hatton was a man of culture and ambition, who saw the strategic value in challenging Spanish dominance of the world's oceans. His support would prove particularly significant, so much so that Drake would later rename his flagship in Hatton's honor, adopting the symbol from Hatton's family crest, a Golden Hind, a female deer rendered in gleaming gold. Through such connections, Drake also came to the attention of the Queen herself. Elizabeth Tudor was a monarch of remarkable subtlety, who understood that England's future lay not in direct confrontation with mighty Spain, but in the careful erosion of Spanish dominance through commerce, exploration, and what could politely be termed unofficial warfare. Drake, with his proven record against Spanish interests and his burning ambition, represented exactly the kind of asset the Queen found useful. She would even, quietly, invest in his venture, though her involvement would remain carefully concealed. But it was through another connection that Drake's grand scheme would truly take shape. Thomas Doughty was a gentleman of education and refinement, a man who moved easily in court circles and who possessed connections that even Drake's growing network could not quite match. Doughty and Drake formed a partnership that seemed, at first, perfectly complementary. Doughty could open doors at court, could speak the language of nobles and investors. Drake could provide the maritime expertise, the experience, the proven ability to navigate dangerous waters and return with profit. Together, they began to develop what they called the venture into the Pacific, though in polite company, they spoke of it in vaguer terms, as an expedition for trade and exploration. The true purpose was more audacious: to sail into the Pacific Ocean, that Spanish lake, and to demonstrate that England too could reach those distant waters. And if, along the way, they happened to intercept Spanish treasure ships sailing undefended because they believed no enemy could possibly reach those waters, well, such were the fortunes of the sea. The scheme required substantial investment. Ships had to be purchased and fitted out, crews hired, provisions laid in for what might be a voyage of years. Drake and Doughty presented their plan to a select group of what were known as gentlemen adventurers, wealthy individuals who invested in risky ventures hoping for extraordinary returns. The proposal was tantalizing: a voyage that would open new trade routes, explore unknown lands, and quite possibly return laden with Spanish gold. By late 1577, the investments had been secured. The expedition would consist of 5 ships, a small fleet designed to support each other across vast distances. The flagship was the Pelican, a vessel of about 100 tons, which Drake himself would command. This was his ship, the vessel that would carry his dreams across unknown waters. The Elizabeth, a smaller ship of 80 tons, would be captained by John Winter, an experienced sailor. The Marigold, tiny at just 30 tons, would be commanded by John Thomas. There was also the Christopher, a supply ship of 15 tons under Thomas Moon, and the Swan, another small supply vessel of 50 tons under John Chester. Each captain had been carefully chosen, each ship meticulously prepared. The holds were filled with provisions for what they publicly claimed would be a voyage to the eastern Mediterranean and beyond, though those closest to Drake understood the true destination lay in the opposite direction entirely. They carried not just food and water, but trading goods, weapons, tools for ship repair, and navigational instruments that represented the cutting edge of maritime technology. The fleet was to sail from Plymouth, that great harbour on England's southwest coast where so many expeditions had begun and ended. But before they could reach the open Atlantic and turn toward their true destination, Drake knew they would need to take on additional supplies and additional plunder. For while the gentlemen adventurers had invested substantially, the voyage would be long and expensive, and Drake had learned from experience that Spanish ships and settlements could help fund English expeditions. As the ships prepared to depart in December 1577, Drake stood on the deck of the Pelican and looked out at his small fleet. 5 ships, fewer than 200 men, embarking on a voyage that would take them to the uttermost ends of the earth. The venture was fraught with danger: storms, disease, starvation, Spanish warships, and the simple fact that the Pacific was so vast that ships could sail for months without sight of land. Many expeditions had set out with similar hopes and had simply vanished, their fates unknown, their crews swallowed by the sea's indifference. But Drake carried with him that vision from the mountains of Panama, the sight of the Pacific spreading blue and limitless before him. Whatever lay ahead, whatever hardships awaited, he would fulfill that vow made with his hand upon a tree at the summit of the world. He would sail an English ship upon those waters, and he would return to tell the tale. The 5 ships slipped out of Plymouth Sound in December 1577, their sails catching the winter wind, their hulls laden with hope and uncertainty. The water was grey and cold, reflecting the overcast English sky, but Drake stood at the helm of the Pelican with the steady confidence of a man who had made his decision and would not look back. Behind him lay England, comfort, safety. Ahead lay everything unknown. The fleet made its way south, following the familiar sea routes along the European coast. But these were dangerous waters even before reaching enemy territory, and Drake understood that his expedition needed more than the provisions already aboard. The first opportunity came at Cape Rear, off the coast of Morocco, where the ships encountered Portuguese and Spanish fishing vessels. Drake's men seized what they needed: fresh food, water, and intelligence about Spanish shipping movements further south. It was a reminder to his crews that this voyage would not be conducted according to the genteel rules of legitimate trade. Further down the African coast, at Cape Blanc, Drake's piratical tendencies revealed themselves again. Here the fleet captured a Portuguese ship, and Drake made a decision that showed both his pragmatism and his willingness to bend the rules of civilized warfare. He appropriated the vessel's pilot, a man named Nuno da Silva, whose knowledge of Atlantic currents and South American coastlines would prove invaluable. Da Silva had no choice in the matter. He was simply informed that he would be accompanying the English expedition, his expertise commandeered as surely as any cargo. The fleet continued south to the Cape Verde Islands, that Portuguese outpost in the Atlantic where ships bound for Africa and the Americas often stopped for provisions. Here Drake's actions became even bolder. His ships raided the islands, taking on fresh water and supplies, and captured another Portuguese vessel, the Santa Maria. This ship was not just seized for its cargo. Drake recognized its value as an additional ship for his fleet. He renamed it the Mary and absorbed it into his expedition, along with its crew and stores. With 6 ships now under his command, Drake turned his fleet westward, toward the vast expanse of the Atlantic. This was the crossing that separated the known from the unknown, the familiar from the terrifying. Weeks would pass with nothing but water in every direction, the ships keeping station with each other through careful navigation and agreed-upon signals. The crews settled into the rhythm of ocean sailing, the endless watches, the maintenance of rigging and sails, the careful rationing of food and fresh water. The crossing to Brazil tested both ships and men. Storms rose up from nowhere, transforming calm seas into heaving mountains of water that threatened to swallow the smaller vessels. The Christopher and the Swan, being the smallest ships, struggled more than the others, their bows plunging into waves that sent spray cascading across their decks. But Drake's careful seamanship and his captain's skill brought all 6 vessels safely across, and eventually the coast of South America appeared on the horizon, a low green line that grew more distinct with each passing hour. They made landfall on the Brazilian coast, in the region near the River Plate, where they could take on fresh water and allow the crews to recover from the Atlantic crossing. The land here was lush and strange, filled with birds and plants that no Englishman had seen before. The men who went ashore spoke of the strangeness of it all, the heat, the unfamiliar sounds of the jungle, the sense of having traveled to the very edge of the world they knew. But this was merely the beginning. Ahead lay Magellan Strait, that legendary passage through the southern tip of the continent that separated the Atlantic from the Pacific. As the fleet sailed south along the coast of South America, following the path that Magellan had traced decades earlier, tensions began to emerge. Thomas Doughty, the gentleman who had helped secure backing for the voyage, began to question Drake's decisions. The nature of their disagreement was complex, part personality clash, part genuine difference of opinion about how the expedition should be conducted. Doughty believed that as a gentleman and investor, he should have significant say in the voyage's direction. Drake, increasingly, saw this as a challenge to his authority as the fleet's admiral. The friction between them grew with each passing day. Doughty made remarks that Drake interpreted as undermining his command. He spoke to other gentlemen aboard the ships, raising questions about Drake's methods, his background, his fitness to lead men of education and breeding. To Drake, who had worked his entire life to rise above his station, who had proven himself time and again in dangerous waters, these suggestions were not just insulting, they were dangerous. A ship's crew, isolated in vast oceans far from any authority but their captains, could turn mutinous if they sensed division among their leaders. Drake's experience on the Spanish Main had taught him that mutiny was the greatest threat any captain faced. He had seen expeditions fail not because of storms or Spanish warships, but because crews lost faith in their commanders and turned against them. In the vast southern waters they were now entering, thousands of miles from any English port, with no possibility of reinforcement or resupply, unity of command was not just important, it was survival itself. The fleet continued south, the air growing colder, the coastline more barren and forbidding. They were approaching the Strait of Magellan, that narrow passage between the Atlantic and Pacific that only a handful of ships had ever successfully navigated. The water turned from blue to grey-green, the winds became fiercer, and the men began to understand just how far from home they truly were. Some must have wondered whether Drake's vision of the Pacific was worth the price they might have to pay. Others simply did their duty, trusting that their captain knew what he was doing, that his reputation was built on more than just ambition. The fleet reached Port San Julian in June 1578, a desolate harbour on the Patagonian coast where the wind howled across grey waters and the land seemed to stretch empty to the ends of the earth. This was the same anchorage where Magellan had stopped nearly 60 years before, and it carried with it an ominous history. Here, Magellan had faced a mutiny among his captains and had executed the ringleaders. The parallels were not lost on Drake, nor on Thomas Doughty. By now, the friction between Drake and Doughty had escalated beyond mere disagreement. Drake had moved Doughty from ship to ship, trying to limit his influence, but the damage was done. Whispers circulated among the gentlemen adventurers and crew alike. Some questioned why a man of relatively humble origins should command gentlemen. Others wondered whether Drake's promises of Pacific riches were mere fantasy, whether they would all perish in these frozen southern waters for nothing more than one man's ambition. Drake knew that he stood at a crossroads. He could attempt to smooth over the tensions, to negotiate and compromise with Doughty and his supporters. Or he could act decisively, in a way that would leave no doubt about who commanded this expedition. The choice Drake made would define not just this voyage, but his entire legacy. He called for a trial. On a windswept shore at Port San Julian, with the ships anchored offshore and the crews assembled as witnesses, Drake charged Thomas Doughty with mutiny and treason. The proceedings had the form of English justice. Testimony was heard, evidence presented, Doughty given opportunity to defend himself. But the outcome was never truly in doubt. Drake needed to demonstrate, beyond any possible misunderstanding, that his authority was absolute. The jury, composed of ship's officers and gentlemen, delivered their verdict, guilty. The sentence was death. Doughty was given a choice, to be marooned on the desolate coast, to be returned to England in chains to face trial there, or to accept execution immediately. In a gesture that spoke to both men's strange relationship, part partnership, part rivalry, Doughty chose execution. More remarkably still, Drake and Doughty took communion together before the sentence was carried out, sharing bread and wine as if they were still friends, as if this were all some elaborate play that required them to perform their roles to the bitter end. On July 2nd, 1578, Thomas Doughty was beheaded. The execution sent a stark message to every man in the fleet. Drake's command was absolute, and challenges to his authority would be met with the ultimate penalty. But Drake understood that fear alone could not sustain an expedition into unknown waters. After Doughty's death, he addressed the entire company, speaking with a directness that was unusual for the hierarchical world of Elizabethan England. He told them that the voyage ahead would require unity, that gentlemen and sailors must work together as one company, for the ocean made no distinction between noble birth and common origins when it came to drowning or starving. He made it clear that those who did not wish to continue could return to England in one of the smaller ships. There would be no shame in it, no punishment. But those who remained must commit themselves entirely to the venture, to following his command without question or hesitation. It was a moment of brutal honesty and calculated leadership. Drake needed his men to choose to follow him, to actively commit rather than simply continue through inertia or fear. And choose they did. The vast majority elected to continue, perhaps swayed by Drake's words, perhaps by the promise of Spanish gold, perhaps by simple curiosity about what lay beyond that distant Pacific. With this matter settled, Drake made another decisive change. He reduced his fleet, abandoning the smaller, less seaworthy vessels. The Christopher was broken up for spare parts. The Swan was left behind, along with the Mary. The expedition would continue with just 3 ships, the Pelican, the Elizabeth, and the Marigold. It was a practical decision. Fewer ships meant fewer mouths to feed, less coordination needed in dangerous waters, and more concentrated force if they encountered Spanish vessels. But it also meant that each remaining ship became more precious, more vital to the expedition's success. Before departing Port San Julian, Drake performed one more symbolic act. He renamed his flagship. The Pelican became the Golden Hind, adopting the symbol from Sir Christopher Hatton's family crest, the golden female deer. It was both a gesture of respect to one of his most important backers and a signal that this ship, this voyage, had transformed into something greater than its original conception. The Golden Hind would carry them forward into legend. In August 1578, the 3 remaining ships entered the Strait of Magellan. This was the passage that had defeated so many, a winding channel between the mainland of South America and the islands of Tierra del Fuego, where currents ran fierce and winds could change direction without warning. The strait twisted and turned through a landscape of stunning desolation. Mountains rose sheer from the water, their peaks dusted with snow even in summer. The shores were rocky and forbidding, offering few safe anchorages. Glacier carved into the water with sounds like thunder, sending waves radiating outward. The passage took weeks of careful navigation. The ships had to wait for favorable winds, anchor in protected coves when storms arose, send boats ahead to sound the depths and search for channels. Drake consulted the charts made by Magellan's expedition, but much had to be learned through direct experience. Where the currents ran strongest, where hidden rocks lurked beneath the surface, where the wind funneled through mountain passes with enough force to snap a mast. The crews worked in conditions of extraordinary hardship. The cold penetrated everything, making ropes stiff and fingers numb. Fresh water could be found from streams running down from the mountains, but venturing ashore was always risky. The Tehuelche people who inhabited these regions were understandably wary of European ships. Food supplies were carefully rationed, with each man receiving his allotted portion and no more. The psychological strain was perhaps even greater than the physical. The knowledge that they were so far from any help, that turning back would be nearly as dangerous as going forward, that everything now depended on their ship's integrity and their captain's skill. But slowly, carefully, the three ships made their way through the strait. And then, after weeks of threading through that dangerous passage, they emerged into different waters. The Pacific Ocean opened before them, vast and forbidding. Drake had fulfilled the first part of his vow. He had brought English ships into the Pacific. But he was about to discover that the ocean Magellan had named for its supposed peacefulness could be anything but calm. The Pacific greeted Drake's three ships not with the calm that gave it its name, but with a fury that seemed almost personal. Within days of emerging from the Strait of Magellan, a storm descended upon them. Not the kind of storm that passes in a few hours, but a relentless tempest that raged for weeks. The wind came from the north and west, driving the ships backward and southward, away from their intended course along the Chilean coast and toward waters that no European had ever charted. The crews fought for survival. Waves rose higher than the ship's masts, crashing over the decks with enough force to sweep men into the sea. The ships climbed the faces of these moving mountains of water and plunged into the troughs beyond, their timbers groaning, water pouring through every gap in the planking. Men worked the pumps in shifts, desperate to keep ahead of the water accumulating in the holds. Sails were torn to shreds and had to be replaced with spares. Then those spares were destroyed and replaced again, until the sailmakers worked day and night stitching canvas with fingers raw from cold and salt. In the chaos of the storm, the three ships became separated. The tiny Marigold, with her crew of just 30 men under Captain John Thomas, simply vanished. One moment she was there, visible through the spray and driving rain, and the next she was gone. Drake searched for her when the weather briefly moderated, sailing back and forth across the grey waters. But there was no sign, no wreckage, no survivors, nothing. The Marigold and all her crew had been swallowed by the Pacific, becoming part of the ocean's countless mysteries. It was a sobering reminder of the price of ambition. The storm drove the Golden Hind and the Elizabeth far to the south, into waters that would eventually become known as the Drake Passage. Here Drake made a discovery of profound geographical importance, though its significance would not be fully appreciated for many years. The land ended. South of the Strait of Magellan, the South American continent did not extend indefinitely toward the South Pole as geographers had believed. Instead, it terminated in a series of islands, and beyond those islands lay open ocean, a sea route around the Cape, an alternative to the dangerous Strait of Magellan. Drake had discovered what would later be recognized as Cape Horn, though he likely did not realize the full implications at the time. When the storm finally subsided after nearly 2 months, Drake found himself alone. The Elizabeth, under Captain John Winter, was nowhere to be seen. Unbeknownst to Drake, Winter had made a decision during the tempest. Battered by the storms, low on provisions, and convinced that the Golden Hind must have been lost, Winter chose survival over loyalty. He turned the Elizabeth around and sailed back through the Strait of Magellan, eventually returning to England. It was desertion, though Winter would later claim it was a reasonable decision given the circumstances. Drake and his crew aboard the Golden Hind faced a moment of profound isolation. They were alone in the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from home, with no support, no resupply, and no knowledge of whether their sister ships had survived or perished. The psychological impact must have been immense. Some of the crew surely questioned whether Drake's ambition had led them to their doom. They had set out with 5 ships and over 160 men. Now they were a single vessel with perhaps 80 souls aboard, adrift in the vastness of the Pacific. But Drake was not a man easily deterred. If anything, the reduction to a single ship simplified his decision-making. There was no fleet to coordinate, no other captains to consult. The Golden Hind and her crew were now entirely his responsibility, and he would use that freedom to pursue the objective that had driven him from the beginning. He turned north, toward the coast of Chile, toward the Spanish settlements and treasure ships that sailed these waters in blissful ignorance that an English predator had entered their domain. The journey up the Chilean coast transformed the expedition from exploration to piracy. Drake raided Spanish ports, seizing supplies, charts, and intelligence. At Valparaiso, he captured a Spanish ship in the harbor and helped himself to its cargo of wine and gold. The Spanish were completely unprepared for attack in these waters. They had no warship stationed in the Pacific, no coastal defenses worth mentioning. Why would they need such things? The Pacific was their ocean, protected by the vast distances and difficult passages that made it unreachable to their enemies. Or so they had thought. But Drake's greatest prize still lay ahead. As he moved up the coast, interrogating captured Spanish sailors and examining seized documents, he learned of a ship that had recently departed from Lima, Peru, bound for Panama. This was no ordinary vessel. The Nuestra Señora de la Concepción, nicknamed Cacafuego by Spanish sailors, was carrying a cargo of almost unimaginable value, a king's ransom in silver, gold, and precious stones from the mines of Peru and the treasuries of Spanish officials in South America. The chase became Drake's obsession. He drove the Golden Hind northward, following every rumor and report of the treasure ship's location. He offered rewards to his own crew for whoever first sighted her. The hunt took them along the entire western coast of South America, past countless Spanish settlements where the inhabitants watched in disbelief as an English ship sailed brazenly through waters they had considered exclusively their own. Some Spanish ships tried to flee at the Golden Hind's approach. Others, assuming the vessel must be Spanish since no enemy could possibly be in these waters, approached without suspicion only to find themselves captured. And then, off the coast of Ecuador on March 1st, 1579, the lookout aboard the Golden Hind called out the words Drake had been waiting to hear. A sail had been spotted on the horizon, matching the description of the Cacafuego. The hunt was about to reach its climax. The Golden Hind closed in on her prey with careful deliberation. Drake knew that approaching too aggressively might cause the Spanish ship to flee or, worse, to jettison her precious cargo overboard. So he employed a ruse, trailing drags behind his ship to slow her down, making the Golden Hind appear to be an ordinary merchant vessel laboring under a heavy load. The Cacafuego's captain, San Juan de Anton, suspected nothing. Why would he? No enemy ship had ever reached these waters. When the English vessel finally drew alongside and Drake's men revealed themselves, demanding surrender, the Spanish were so astonished they could barely comprehend what was happening. The capture was accomplished with minimal violence, a few cannon shots to demonstrate serious intent, and the Cacafuego struck her colors. What Drake found in her holds exceeded even his ambitious expectations. There were 13 chests of silver coins, 80 pounds of gold, 26 tons of silver bars, pearls, precious stones, and countless other valuables. The exact worth was difficult to calculate, but by some estimates it represented more wealth than the entire annual revenue of the English crown. It took several days to transfer all the treasure to the Golden Hind, and when it was done, Drake treated the Spanish captain with surprising courtesy, giving him a gift of fine cloth and a safe conduct letter before releasing him and his ship to continue on their way, now empty. With the Cacafuego's treasure secure in his hold, Drake faced a critical decision. He was now the richest pirate in history, carrying a fortune in Spanish gold and silver, but he was also thousands of miles from England with no friendly port in between. He had 3 possible routes home, each fraught with its own dangers. The first option was to return the way he had come, back down the South American coast and through the Strait of Magellan. But by now, news of the English raider would have spread throughout Spanish America. The Viceroy of Peru would have dispatched warships to hunt him down. The strait would likely be guarded, and even if it wasn't, the storms that had nearly destroyed his fleet on the outward passage awaited him again. It seemed a route almost certain to end in capture or death. The second option was to search for the legendary Northwest Passage, a hypothetical strait through North America that geographers speculated might connect the Pacific to the Atlantic somewhere in the northern latitudes. If such a passage existed, it would provide a direct route back to England while avoiding Spanish-controlled waters entirely. It was an appealing idea, but entirely theoretical. No one had ever found this passage, and Drake had no particular reason to believe he would succeed where others had failed. The third option was the most audacious: to continue west, across the entire Pacific Ocean, around Africa, and back to England. This would make Drake only the second captain to circumnavigate the globe, following Magellan's route in reverse. It was a journey of unknown length through largely uncharted waters, requiring supplies and repairs that Drake could only obtain by making landfall in territories controlled by Spain's ally, Portugal. But it had one crucial advantage: it was unexpected. The Spanish would be watching for him to return through the Strait of Magellan or to attempt a northern route. They would never imagine he would dare to circle the entire globe. Drake chose to first explore the northern option, sailing up the coast of Central America and New Spain, past Mexico and into the waters off what is now California. The Golden Hind's hull had suffered during the storms and months at sea. She was leaking, her planking damaged, her rigging worn. Drake needed a safe harbor where he could careen the ship, scrape her hull clean of barnacles and marine growth, and make necessary repairs before attempting any long ocean crossing. In June 1579, Drake found such a place, a sheltered bay on the California coast, which he named Nova Albion, or New Albion, claiming the territory for Queen Elizabeth. The exact location has been debated by historians ever since, with various bays north of San Francisco proposed as candidates, though Drake's Bay is the most commonly suggested. Here the Golden Hind was beached at high tide, and as the water receded, the crew could work on her hull, replacing damaged planks and caulking seams with oakum and tar. The local coast Miwok people observed these strange visitors with curiosity. Drake's records describe encounters with native inhabitants who seemed friendly, bringing gifts and watching the English at their repairs with what appeared to be a mixture of wonder and hospitality. The English remained for over a month, not just repairing their ship but also recovering from their long voyage, taking on fresh water, hunting for meat, and gathering whatever supplies the land offered. It was a crucial respite, a chance to prepare for the enormous journey that lay ahead. By July 1579, the Golden Hind was seaworthy again, her hull sound, her supplies replenished as much as possible. Drake had explored far enough north to satisfy himself that if a northwest passage existed, it lay beyond his ability to find it in a ship already strained by months at sea. He made his choice. They would sail west, across the Pacific, and attempt the full circumnavigation. It was a decision that committed his crew to months more at sea, with no possibility of turning back. The Pacific crossing was an exercise in endurance. The ocean lived up to its name this time, remaining relatively calm, but its very size became the enemy. Week after week, the Golden Hind sailed west across water that seemed to have no end. The crew rationed their supplies carefully, knowing that running out of food or water in the middle of this vast ocean meant certain death. The psychological strain was enormous. Day after day of seeing nothing but empty horizon, with no way to know how much farther they had to go. Eventually, after 68 days at sea, land appeared, the Caroline Islands in Micronesia, where they could take on fresh water and food. From there, Drake navigated through the Philippine archipelago, carefully avoiding Spanish outposts, and reached the Spice Islands of the Moluccas in what is now Indonesia. Here Drake negotiated with the Sultan of Ternate, obtaining not just supplies but also a valuable cargo of cloves, adding legitimate trade goods to his hold of Spanish treasure. The Sultan, who had his own grievances with the Portuguese, welcomed the English captain and saw potential for future trade relations. The Golden Hind continued west, navigating through the Indonesian archipelago. And then, on January 9th, 1580, disaster nearly struck. The ship ran aground on a coral reef off the coast of Celebes, now known as Sulawesi. The impact was sudden and terrifying, one moment sailing in deep water, the next moment grinding to a halt as the hull struck rock. The ship was stuck fast, held by the coral, and with each passing hour the situation grew more desperate. The Golden Hind lay trapped on the coral reef, her hull grinding against the sharp rocks with each slight movement of the tide. The situation was desperate. If the ship remained stuck until the next low tide, she might break apart entirely. If they could not free her, the crew would be marooned on a remote island with no hope of rescue, their fortune in Spanish treasure becoming nothing more than ballast in a ship slowly torn apart by the sea. Drake and his crew tried everything. They attempted to kedge the ship off, rowing an anchor out in the ship's boat and then using the capstan to pull the Golden Hind toward it. But the coral held fast. They threw cargo overboard to lighten the ship, barrels of provisions, spare equipment, anything that might reduce the draft. Still the ship remained stuck. The hours passed with agonizing slowness, and the crew's desperation grew. Some fell to their knees in prayer, calling upon God for deliverance from what seemed like certain doom. And then, as if in answer to those prayers, the wind shifted. A breeze came up from a new quarter, and with it the tide began to turn. The water level rose, lifting the Golden Hind ever so slightly off the coral. The crew redoubled their efforts, working the capstan, shifting weight from side to side, doing everything humanly possible to help the ship free herself. And slowly, with a groaning sound that seemed to come from the vessel's very soul, the Golden Hind slid off the reef and into deeper water. The relief was overwhelming. Men who had been certain they were about to die found themselves instead afloat and free. Drake immediately had the crew inspect the hull for damage. Miraculously, while the ship had taken some scrapes and dents, there were no serious breaches. The sturdy English oak had held. They had been delivered from disaster by what seemed like divine intervention, and the crew's faith in both God and their captain was renewed. The Golden Hind continued her journey westward, now sailing more cautiously, sounding the depths frequently, posting extra lookouts to watch for reefs and shoals. They navigated through the Indonesian archipelago, past Java, and into the Indian Ocean. This was Portuguese-controlled territory, and Drake had to avoid major ports and settlements where his presence might trigger pursuit. The Golden Hind sailed like a ghost ship, appearing briefly at remote anchorages for water and provisions, then vanishing before word could spread. The crossing of the Indian Ocean was long but relatively uneventful. The monsoon winds carried them westward, toward Africa. Month after month passed with only the endless rhythm of the sea. Watches kept, sails trimmed, the ship maintained, and always the careful rationing of supplies. The crew had now been at sea for well over 2 years, and they were becoming gaunt and weathered, their bodies lean from hard work and limited rations, their faces lined by sun and salt spray. They rounded the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, that notorious convergence of oceans where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet and weather can turn violent without warning. But fortune favored Drake here. The passage was accomplished without incident, and the Golden Hind entered the Atlantic Ocean, the final leg of her incredible journey. The crew's spirits lifted. These were waters they knew, routes they understood. They were truly heading home now. The final stretch required careful planning. Drake could not simply sail into an English port without preparation. He had no way of knowing what political situation awaited him in England. Queen Elizabeth's relationship with Spain was delicate and ever-changing. What if, in his absence, England and Spain had made peace? What if his raids on Spanish territory and ships were now considered an embarrassment rather than an asset? Drake could return as a hero laden with treasure, or as a pirate to be hanged for disturbing diplomatic relations. He approached cautiously, first stopping at Sierra Leone on the African coast to take on fresh provisions, then crossing to the Azores, still avoiding major ports. Finally, in September 1580, nearly 3 years after departing, the Golden Hind sailed into Plymouth Sound. Drake sent word ahead, testing the waters, trying to gauge what reception awaited him. The news that came back was better than he could have hoped. Queen Elizabeth was delighted by his success and eager to see both him and his treasure. On September 26, 1580, Francis Drake stepped ashore in England, having accomplished what only one other expedition in history had achieved, the circumnavigation of the globe. But unlike Magellan's voyage, which had lost 4 or 5 ships and most of its crew, including its captain, Drake had brought his single ship and most of his men home safely, along with a treasure that exceeded anyone's wildest expectations. The impact of Drake's voyage rippled through England and across Europe. Queen Elizabeth, delighted by both the treasure and the blow to Spanish prestige, visited the Golden Hind at Deptford and knighted Drake aboard his ship. The Spanish ambassador protested furiously, demanding that Drake be punished as a pirate and the stolen treasure returned. Elizabeth, with typical Tudor cunning, ignored these demands while privately enjoying the wealth that Drake's private venture had brought to her coffers. The treasure from the Cacafuego and other Spanish prizes made Drake fabulously wealthy and enriched his investors beyond their dreams. But perhaps more importantly, the voyage shattered the myth of Spanish invincibility. Drake had demonstrated that Spanish control of the Pacific was an illusion, that their treasure fleets were vulnerable, that English ships and English captains could sail anywhere in the world and return to tell the tale. It was a psychological blow from which Spanish dominance would never fully recover. The legacy of Drake's circumnavigation extended far beyond the immediate wealth and glory. He had gathered information about Spanish defenses, mapped coastlines, established potential trade contacts, and proven that English maritime capability could rival any nation's. The Golden Hind herself became a symbol, preserved for years as a monument to the voyage. Drake's charts and observations would inform English naval strategy for decades to come. And perhaps most importantly, Drake had shown that the age of exploration was not over, that there were still discoveries to be made, routes to be charted, possibilities to be pursued. The world was larger than anyone had imagined when viewed from that mountain in Panama, but it was also more accessible than the Spanish wanted anyone to believe. One man's vision, sustained through storms and mutiny and impossible distances, had opened new horizons for England and changed the course of history. As night falls and this story draws to a close, imagine the Golden Hind at rest in Plymouth Harbour, her voyage complete, her timbers bearing the marks of 3 years at sea and 40,000 miles of ocean. Imagine Drake standing on her deck one final time, looking out at the water that had carried him around the world and brought him home. The sea, endless and eternal, whispers its secrets to those brave enough to listen, and promises wonders to those willing to sail beyond the edge of what is known into the vast blue mystery of what might be. Sleep well, and let the gentle rhythms of the ocean carry you into peaceful dreams.